Please welcome Chief of Operations of RealT and host of POV Crypto, David Hoffman.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Hoffman. I run a podcast, POV Crypto, and I'm also COO of RealT, Tokenized Real Estate. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the Ethereum ecosystem, and specifically Ether, our all-beloved token. And I think that we as a community don't spend enough time thinking about Ether, because it's really, really important. We haven't really tried to define what it is as an asset in the world of other assets. And likewise, we also haven't really defined Ethereum very well, which kind of makes sense because Ethereum's capabilities are so endless. It feels like trying to define the internet in the 80s. We don't really know what's coming. So I try and propose my model for Ether as an asset using my own definition of Ethereum. So the talk outline is first we define Ethereum, but we also have to define the internet because the internet is the substrate that Ethereum lives on, and you can't define it, have a definition for something without having a foundation. And then we go into defining asset classes, which there are 3 of, and then we define Ether using those 3 asset classes, which I define Ether as a triple point asset, which is a reference to chemistry, and also economic bandwidth for permissionlessness on Ethereum. And then we bring it all together and talk about what that means for the future of Ethereum. There are 2 assumptions in this slide, in this presentation. One is that Ethereum 2.0 is live and well, and EIP 1559, which changes the way fees are managed, and it burns a portion of the Ether rather than sending all of it to the validators. So part 1, defining Ethereum. Again, we need to start, before we define Ethereum, we need to define the world that Ethereum lives inside of, which is the internet. And so if you type this, what is the internet, into Google, you'll get this definition. The internet is a global computer network providing a variety of information and communication facilities consisting of interconnected networks using standardized communication protocols. Was that helpful in describing what the internet is? I would say that that was not very helpful because that did nothing to communicate any of these things, which when you go onto the internet, this is what you see 90% of the time. This is 90% of the activity on the internet. This is how the internet qualitatively impacts our lives. And because the internet is just a network of computers, these aren't the internet. The internet is a piece of infrastructure that the applications that we use live on top of, which means that I contend that the application layer of the internet is actually the most important layer. It's the layer that defines what the internet means to us as we use it. This is the internet tech stack, starting with the hardware, the actual cabling between all the computers, and then the protocol for communication, and then the applications that live on top. And so what this means for Ethereum is that Ethereum will be defined by its applications. If we want to learn and guess what Ethereum will do for us, we need to look at the applications that will exist upon it. And so with this in mind, I define Ethereum as a global open source platform for decentralized applications. Excuse me, this is not my definition. This is Ethereum.org's definition. On Ethereum, you can write code that controls digital value, runs exactly as programmed, and is accessible anywhere in the world. To simplify, I define Ethereum as the internet of value. It's this new layer inside of the internet tech stack that defines how value is transported. The cool thing that Bitcoin did was generate digital scarcity, but it only did so for Bitcoin. It didn't do it for anything else. And the ERC20 token and all the other tokens that you can issue on Ethereum mean that we can have an internet of value of tokens that have defined value based on whatever that token does. And so we have the old world, the Web 2.0 stack on the left, and then we have this fertile land of the value layer, which has yet to be built out, that has this new application layer on top of it, which we call open finance or DeFi. And so here is the early ARPANET in 1969, I believe. And we can see how the network and the nodes grow over the years. And it actually took the internet almost 20 years to get to this point in 1982. I think it was in 1982. And we can see a very comparable growth in network in DeFi, or open finance. This was in November of 2018 with the 4 major applications that we call DeFi applications. A handful of users making transactions between protocols, not too much economic activity, but we can start to see the early beginnings of a financial layer inside of the internet. And it explodes. This is just 6 or 7 months later, in May of 2019. The same 4 protocols starts to grow a lot more in volume, liquidity, transactions. And then this was just last month. 8 protocols here in this image. Endless permutations of transactions going between this financial layer, this internet of value. But not only is it horizontal, but it's also vertical. The Ethereum ecosystem is a financial system, and finance stratifies. We have the fundamental base layer of Ethereum, and again, this is in Ethereum 2.0, which is the reference to the ETH stake rate. But then we also have these other systems of financial applications that provide structure to the applications that exist upon it. So here's our old, we've seen this stratification before, right? We have this permissionless store of value asset, which is gold, but it's captured by the central banks of the world. And then the member banks have to ask permission to the central banks. And then the payment processors ask permission to the banks that serve their needs. And then the businesses ask permission to the payment processors. And then we have to sign up using our email and password on the business's website. So it's permissioned all the way down because of the capturing of each business in the stack above it. And so Ethereum turns this on its head, and I'll get more into that later. And so here's my definition for Ethereum. Ethereum is the internet of value, the internet native global settlement layer for digital assets, a landscape of permissionless financial applications which together support a permissionless economy. So that's Ethereum. Now we're going to define asset classes, because again, the goal is to define Ether. There are 3 asset classes, and a large part of this section of the talk stands on the shoulders of Chris Bernisky and his blog with Placeholder VC, who also stood on the shoulders of Robert Greer in his 1997 paper, What is an Asset Class Anyways? And so we have to be humble and always think about the predecessors of who have thought about these things before. So there are 3 asset classes: capital assets, consumable transformable assets, and store of value assets. So starting with capital assets, are productive assets. They produce something for the owner, whether it's more of itself, cash flow, some sort of value. And equities, companies are the OG capital assets. The whole goal of a company is to produce cash flow. So if you buy a stock on the stock market, whether it's dividend paying or not, you get some sort of revenue in the valuation of the asset. Bonds and treasuries, also very old capital assets, provide you a guaranteed interest rate over a certain amount of time based off of the time length of the treasury. Real estate, you have the asset and you can rent it out, receive cash flow, and then taxi medallions as well. This scarce finite number taxi medallion, which allows you privilege to work and generate cash flow for the owner. Then we also have consumable transformable assets. I like to call these one-time use assets that provide some sort of economic yield. Wheat, coffee, gold, energy. They do not produce an ongoing stream of value, and you can turn these things into another asset, and it's usually just a consumable for achieving some sort of goal. And then finally, store of value assets cannot be consumed, and their value, importantly, persists across space and time, and they are scarce. And these lines can blur. You don't have to just be one asset type. Gold is a great store of value, perhaps the best store of value across time, but it's also used in industry because it doesn't decay and it is very electroconductive, meaning that you can use it in industry without the metal breaking down, and you can also pass data through it. Real estate is also a store of value, and it's also a capital asset because you have the asset itself, which is scarce, and you can also rent it out and receive revenue. And so the valuation of real estate is a combination of its store of value qualities and its capital asset qualities. So what is Ether? I contend that Ether, again, this is a table from Placeholder, I contend that Ether is the first asset to be all three asset types all at the same time. You get to do all three of these things with Ether. So Ether is a capital asset. It is a share of the Ethereum network. If we illustrate the Ethereum network as kind of like a decentralized company, its asset, the equity of Ethereum, is kind of like this permissionless thing that you can buy on markets everywhere. It's a claim on Ethereum's fees, and it's also the right to produce work for Ethereum. All of these things map on to the other capital assets that we know of. Here is the projected rate of return on the ETH2 spec. At the proposed or sought after 10 million ETH staking number, you get a projected 5.7% return, kind of like a 5.7 return bond. That's a one-year bond. That's pretty good, by the way. But on top of that, you also get fees. You get the fees of the Ethereum network based off of your share of Ether. And $3.6 million was spent just last month paying the Ethereum network for its block space. These are Ethereum's top customers. If you own Ether and you are staking it, these are the customers that you are serving. And this operates just like a treasury note. If you buy a treasury note, you put up $1,000, and if it's a 10-year, 8% treasury note, in 10 years you get $1,080 back. Ether works the same. Every epoch, which I believe is 6 minutes, you get a percentage of your Ether back returned to you based off of the stake that you put into it. It's also worth noting that treasury notes are a great way to secure the economy of the United States in the same way that ETH staking is a great way to secure the Ethereum blockchain. And secondly, Ether is a consumable, transformable asset. And before I talk about that, I want to talk about how energy is an economic substrate. Energy comes in many different forms, but it typically is a one-time use thing that you use in order to achieve some sort of goal. And to illustrate this more, I'd like you to imagine this city without any of the energy. The petroleum and the petroleum derivative products that power our cars and the electricity that runs the buildings, moves the people up and down the elevators, the cranes that build the buildings, the energy in your phone or laptop. We consume these things and we pay money for this consumption in order to achieve the goals of our business. And so I contend that Ether is the economic substrate for Ethereum. Anytime an asset is moved, a loan is generated, an exchange is made, a DAO is started, you have to consume Ether. It's the economic substrate for Ethereum. It is the way that you pay taxes to the system to uphold the security for how you use it. And lastly, Ether is a store of value asset, in my opinion, the most important of the three, even though you can't have any one without the others. Ether backs assets. And this is really important. All of these assets that we know and all the ones that we can imagine in our head, most of them will come, the value of those will come from the value of Ether that is collateralizing those assets. Starting with Maker. There's plenty of stablecoins on Ethereum, but there's only one permissionless stablecoin. And the difference between the permissionless stablecoin and the permission stablecoin is that all the permission stablecoins are given their value based off of fiat and a bank, which means we have to trust someone. The DAI is permissionless because it's backed by Ether. It has the collateral of a permissionless asset, which allows DAI to be permissionless itself. And as a result of this, MakerDAO has been able to produce over $400 million in permissionless loans. It's almost $500 million in a year and a half, most of that volume coming in the last 6 months. And this is really important because if you want to have permissionless finance, you need stability, but you also need permissionless stability. Permissionless finance doesn't work with Circlecoin or Tether because it's permissioned. It would be a hybrid permissionless application, permissioned asset, but not with DAI. If we have permissionless applications and a permissionless money, we have fully permissionless applications. So the existence of MakerDAO allows for everything up in the Ethereum economy above it to be fully permissionless. This is a little image I like to illustrate it. Compound, the next thing up in the stack. Compound, over $100 million in loans originated. 66% is either DAI or Ether. And so 66% of the volume going through Compound is fully permissionless. And once Compound fills up its backdoor and becomes fully decentralized, then we will have a fully decentralized application with fully decentralized currencies running inside of it. Here is a graph of the total value in red in Compound denominated in Ether. And then here's purple, which is the total number of Ether in Compound. It's almost all Ether. The reason why Compound is decentralized is because of the permissionless collateral Ether as a store of value inside of it. dydx, it's the same thing. Ether plus DAI equals dydx. The first implementation of dydx was just these two. You can now also use USDC coin, but the volume inside of dydx is 95% Ether and DAI. It's 95% permissionless assets inside of a permissionless application, meaning 95% of the $87 million going through dydx is fully permissionless. Uniswap, it's the same thing. All Uniswap trading pairs is 1 part Ether, 1 part any other token. And so in future versions of Uniswap, they're going to allow you to go from any token to any token, and I'm willing to bet that the next most popular token after Ether is going to be DAI, which is basically just Ether in its stabilized form. And so here's DeFi, total value locked denominated in Ether compared to total value of Ether. It's almost all Ether. The reason why DeFi exists is because of the value of Ether. And so the $620 million originated in DeFi in sum is 95% either DAI or Ether. And so store of value Ether, the value of Ether as a currency is what makes finance permissionless. We've had this financial system which has served us well, except for the 2.5 billion people that have never been served by finance. Now we have this economic substrate, Ethereum, that exists all over the world that has a permissionless financial system built into it. So here's our old model, where everyone has to ask permission because the central banks captured all the gold. And now we flipped it on its head, where Ether is this permissionless store of value, and we allow for permissionlessness to work its way up the stack. Another person who this talk stands on the shoulders of is Dan Elitzer, who tweeted about how he realized that when you submit pool token or liquidity to Uniswap with 1 part Ether, 1 part any other token, you get a receipt, which is an ERC20 token, and you could theoretically use that as collateral. So here's what he was talking about. Inside of the rectangle was what he was referring to, but I started at the beginning. So store of value, Ether, gets put inside a maker to create DAI. And somebody else takes DAI and store of value Ether and puts it into Uniswap and gets the ERC20 Uniswap pool share token. And so this is like the symbol that I made to represent the pool share token that is specifically the DAI to Ether trading pair. And so what Dan was saying is that you can take that pool share token, because it's collateralized by DAI and Ether, and you can put that into Compound and collateralize it again. And, I skipped this part. So we have store of value Ether going into Uniswap, and when you put your collateral in Uniswap, you generate fees. Uniswap gives you 0.3% of the exchange volume, plus a little bit of the market inefficiency fees. And so as it's a store of value, it turns also into a capital asset at the same time, because it's collecting fees from the exchange. And so you take this now store of value and capital asset ETH, and then you put it into Compound, and it acts as a store of value again. It's a double store of value and a capital asset, and then you can take that store of value and you can get DAI and do whatever you want with it. Or you could theoretically go in reverse, and you can lend out your Uniswap pool share tokens to whoever wants it, and then you can receive fees in a token that receives fees. And so it's double capital assets, capital asset squared. And meanwhile, so here are all the transactions. Meanwhile, every step of the way, Ether is getting burned. It's getting consumed to do all of these things. And so this is where I get to the point where Ether is a triple point asset. The triple point is a reference to chemistry where you perfectly balance pressure and temperature for a particular substance, and you can hit all three phases all at the same time. And so here's water being ice, liquid, and gas all at once. It's super cool. And so here's my version of this, is that Ether is right in the middle of all three asset classes. And we've seen this model before. The US dollar is supposed to be a store of value, although it loses 2% every year. The bond, the treasury bill, is a capital asset that receives 2 to 5% every single year. And then when it comes to tax season, we all have to burn our money by giving it to the IRS to support the network of the United States dollar. And so Ether does this in one fluid motion. It does all three at once. Staked Ether as a capital asset, ETH locked in DeFi, ETH locked in finance as a store of value, and then gas as a consumable asset. And so here's how I model Ether into the future. We have a three-way tug of war between ETH locked in DeFi, the ETH stake rate, and the US dollar price. The ETH stake rate and the ETH locked in DeFi compete for Ether inside of Ethereum. They want to fight it for one for security and one to have a growing application. Applications inside of DeFi want to create a reason for you to take your Ether and put it inside of it. At the same time, the ETH stake rate offers you a return on your Ether to lock up your Ether inside of staking. And both of those things pull on the US dollar price. And so here's my another model for Ether is bandwidth for permissionlessness. 80 million DAI use 1.35% of all Ether in order to achieve its job of a stable store of value. Compound, which has $114 million of loans going through it, uses 0.4% of all Ether. Same thing for DYDX and Uniswap. They all use up Ether as economic bandwidth. And so the total bandwidth of the Ethereum financial system for permissionlessness is roughly 2.1%, which doesn't seem like a lot. But if we want to achieve a fully permissionless, decentralized world, there's $1.7 trillion in circulation. If we want that amount of money to come into Ethereum, we need 85 times more bandwidth, which means we need the ETH price to grow by 85 times. If we want synthetic assets backed by if we want permissionless synthetic assets, it needs to be backed by Ether, which means we need 3,600 times more bandwidth. You get the point here. And so if we want this to turn into this, and we want this to grow larger, we need Ether to win this tug-of-war with the US dollar price. It needs to go up so we can have more permissionless assets to be put inside of more permissionless financial applications. And so this is my definition for Ether. It's bandwidth for permissionless finance. And that's my talk.